Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. I'm not very sure because we have speakers, I think, in time zones in Canada and, of course, New Delhi. We are here today to discuss a wonderful book called Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistan Project. Terry is an absolute veteran of the Canadian broadcasting, been coming to India since 1967. So you can imagine on various assignments. He was here also for the 26 after the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai, and he is taking project. You can see the book has Palestinian activities in Canada and a huge amount of research that has gone into this. I'm particularly it's kind of brings back a lot of professional memory. I did as a journalist was to cover this from here in New Delhi, meaning cover this the when this aircraft went down. Didn't want to believe that anyone would have bombed it. Initially, we kept on thinking maybe structural failure, maybe this, maybe that, and it went on until I must say till they actually recovered part of the fuselage, and they actually they couldn't recover all of it. They actually did tests, and they found the very distinct patterns of explosion. And it's that only at that it really sank in that someone had done this, because it was even amongst the acts of terrorism, it was one of the most dastardly and dramatic acts. And as you well know, there was actually plans to bring down two. Second bomb was to come to New Delhi. Fortunately, it delayed, and so the bomb went off. And I think it killed the handler, if I'm not mistaken. So we are here to discuss this, and I have me three discussants. My colleague Chandani, who's a senior fellow and head of department of media studies. I have Balraj Deo, editor and publisher of Khabarnama in Canada. I'm not sure where Balraj is located. And we have Smruti Patnaik, a research fellow, Manohar Parikar Institute for Defense and Analysis. I shouldn't have said Manohar Parikar. I said, I think we will now begin this, and I'll request Terry to make some of his book, what went on behind the scenes, how did he get motivated to write, and we'll have our discussion. Terry, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Foundation for taking an interest in the book, and to my fellow panelists today for taking the time to dig into what is, let's face it, not a very cheerful subject. In fact, you just asked me why I got into this, and I'm often asked, well, Terry, why do you still go on about this problem? Why are you still droning on about it after so long? It's an old story. The Khalistan movement fizzled out 30 years ago. And certainly for Canadians anyway, as Balraj, I'm sure, will confirm, a lot of them would be quite happy never to hear about it again, because, to put it mildly, this was not a story that puts Canada in a good light. It is not a story that fills us with pride. So it's a fair question. Why'd you do it? And the short answer is that I wrote the book largely out of a sense of failure, really, a sense of failure as a Canadian and as a journalist. Most obviously in Canada, the Khalistan saga was focused very much on the Kanishka bombing of 1985, where we Canadians, security services, the police, the spies, failed to stop the bombing, even though we had the suspects under surveillance for months before the bombing. And then the justice system failed to give the victims' families a full measure of justice. We let all but one of the bombers go free. Then I should also include ourselves, the media, reporters like me, who did a very feeble job of explaining to our audience why this happened and how this all happened. And that's why much of the detail in the book may seem new to many of you, even though those of us who were in the courtroom knew about it 20 years ago. We just didn't say so loudly as we could have and should have. But there's more to this story, of course, than one bombing. There is now the continuing effort to keep the old cause alive, if I can put it that way, in the diaspora, if not in India, where the cause is moribund, obviously. And this problem continues to poison the relationship between the world's largest democracy, India, and the other world's largest democracy, Canada. In fact, it poisons it so badly that Prime Minister Trudeau's 2018 visit to India was basically wrecked by the fact that apparently nobody in the Prime Minister's entourage realized that, if you invite a convicted Khalistani terrorist to diplomatic receptions for the Prime Minister in Mumbai and New Delhi and have him pose for photos with the Prime Minister's wife, this would not be a great diplomatic coup. This would make the Prime Minister look ridiculous. And the Prime Minister's staff, they didn't see this as a problem, because it wasn't a problem in Canada, where Khalistanis, to a great degree, have been normalized over the years. And if I can illustrate with a short story, it's what I consider a rather frightening story, told by a friend of mine who's now currently running for Parliament in the Canadian elections. His name is Dave Hare, and his father, as many of you will know, Tara Singh Hare, was murdered when he agreed to testify for the prosecution in the Kanishka bombing trial. And Dave tells of meeting a young girl, he thinks she was maybe 14, 15 years old, who asked him, in all seriousness, why do you refer to the Air India bombers as terrorists? They were heroes, she said. They were heroes. And Dave, of course, was stunned by this and asked her, well, what about the victims? What about the victims' families? And the girl replied, well, I didn't think of that. I didn't think of that. So I suggest to you that we have a problem. 36 years later, we still have kids being brought up. I don't know how many, but I know it's too many, to think that the fanatics who slaughtered 331 completely innocent civilians did a fine thing. And they're being taught this by parents who have a glorious life-size portrait of one of the martyred heroes of Air India, Talwinder Parmar, who organized the bombing. And his picture is permanently fixed now to the outside of important Gurdwara in Surrey, British Columbia. Parmar was, of course, as the author of the Air India plot, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history. And they glorify him as a great hero. So you're forced to look around and ask what's going on. Well, just 2 months ago, another short story, the leader of Sikhs for Justice, Babbar Singh Parmar, who, as you know, is campaigning for a referendum on Sikh independence, created a new Twitter account. Blink and you will miss it. His Twitter accounts don't last very long. He's listed as a terrorist in India. And he managed to get up a new Twitter account, and on it for a couple of weeks anyway. And he tweeted on there, and I'm not making this up, that he insisted that Sikhs should bombard Prime Minister Trudeau with emails demanding the expulsion from Canada of the Indian High Commissioner, Ajay Bisaria, for the crime of, and I'm not making this up either, a hate-mongering speech against Canadian Sikhs, unquote. So what did the High Commissioner say? Oh, Panoon helpfully spelled it out on his tweet. He quoted the High Commissioner accurately as saying on the occasion of the anniversary of the Air India bombing that this the bombing revealed the heavy cost, I'm quoting again, the heavy cost that Khalistani terrorism could inflict on humanity, unquote. So he never mentioned Sikhs or Canadian Sikhs, the ones about which he was allegedly hate-mongering. He never mentioned them. He simply condemned terrorism. And Mr. Panoon of Sikhs for Justice apparently thought that condemning terrorism was a terrible thing, a bad thing, so bad that the High Commissioner should be booted out of Canada. But he never explained, well, what was bad about it. I mean, it seemed quite bizarre on its face. But if you follow these things, you'll be able to decode what he was getting at. And it's a good guess that Mr. Panoon, of course, wants to promote a myth. He wants to rewrite history. He was angry that the High Commissioner called it Khalistani terrorism, whereas Panoon would like people to believe that the Indian government blew up its own plane to make the Khalistanis look bad, supposedly, presumably because thousands of brutal killings and bombings in India somehow didn't make them look bad. So that 300 Canadians, in addition, needed to die, and that would make them look bad, which is an idea which, of course, makes no sense whatsoever. Sikhs for Justice, by the way, also named one of its voter registration centers for the referendum that it proposes, named the center the Shahid Talwinder Singh Parmar Voter Registration Center, complete with a heroic picture of Parmar, of course, and so driving the message home, their message home, that they're not afraid to glorify a mass killer as a martyred model for Sikh youth, if you like. So that's where we are today, and the disinformation that's been spread around this history has been successful to a degree, growing in strength, notably since the Air India trial ended with acquittals, save for one man, the bomb maker, Rayat. Those acquittals were in 2005. And that raises one of the untold stories that is in my book, the strange and really quite incomprehensible story of why the trial failed so spectacularly. It's untold, this story, mainly because reporters like me fell asleep on the job. We fell asleep during the long and tedious legal arguments, which never got on the news, because far too late did we realize that the whole case turned on those arguments. As boring as they were, they caused the most damning evidence to be completely discarded. And we reporters failed to convey that to our readers and viewers, nor did we convey how the trial rewarded and even incentivized the murder and intimidation of witnesses, which is certainly what happened. So, for example, a key witness took the stand, testified that she was terrified that she would be killed if she talked. And no surprise, she clammed up. She suddenly forgot on the witness stand the whole damning story that she had told repeatedly, but in confidence, to an intelligence officer about the night before the bombing and what she saw and heard. And the judge said that because she refused to repeat her story because she was afraid of being killed, that this was, I'm quoting, a violation of the accused's rights. because, get this, the poor man's lawyers would not be able to cross-examine the witness on the story which she refused to tell. But the intelligence officer had written it all down and testified, the judge said, accurately and truthfully about it. But the judge still threw out the whole evidence. So it was as though it never happened as far as the trial was concerned. So we all heard about it, the accused banging on the door of the witness late at night, the night before the bombing, trying to borrow her car to take bags to the airport. But don't worry, he said, he wasn't going anywhere. He would bring the car back. He wasn't traveling. Only the bags were going. And that if he were caught, she would never see him again. He'd be cooked. And we all heard it. The details were also corroborated by other evidence, but it was, as I say, as though it never happened as far as the trial was concerned. We all knew it, but it wasn't technically considered evidence at all. And crucial evidence, by the way, was likewise tossed out in another case where Parmar and his gang were accused of plotting to blow up the Indian Parliament, and in another where Ujjal Assange was beaten nearly to death, and another case where another Air India plane was targeted. This is why I say that Canada was where Sikh terrorism cases went to die. Today, though, one thing has changed for the better. We'll see if Balraj agrees with me on this. It used to be that death threats were pretty common. Balraj, too, was nearly beaten to death, as was Assange. But nowadays, it's lawyers who come banging on your door. The Khalistanis of today are fighting an information war. Really, I should say it's a disinformation war in an effort to rewrite history, to embed their fictional narrative of these events, and through lawsuits to harass and to intimidate those who don't agree that Talwinder Parmar was a big hero, that he was some kind of persecuted innocent who was murdered by a fascist, genocidal government. And for all of these reasons, I think it would be a mistake then to think that this very old battle is over just because it's old. Pakistan has now invested a lot in this struggle over the years. Pakistan is now, of course, celebrating victory in Afghanistan. Sikhs for Justice now says it congratulates the Taliban and will seek their support for an independent Sikh state. And you can say, well, look, come on, Terry, there's no popular support for that. Well, it's never been about popular support. When did it have popular support? Who elected the Babbar Khalsa? Nobody. This is not about popular support. It's about getting revenge, if you like, blood for blood, and it's about fanaticism. It's not about some grassroots desire to live in a new independent state that, of course, would be heavily indebted to Pakistan. So I think there still may be a few more books about this movement before we really hear the last of it. And I'll stop there. You've all been very patient, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Terry. I think you've given us a good idea of the issues out the book, and of course, we have all been dealing of the situation by the authorities in Canada. But in any case, now what we'll do is have our three discussants and ask them to confine their talks to about 10 minutes. And then we can discussion amongst ourselves since we don't have external discussants here. So I'll request Mir Chandani to make her remarks.
Thanks a lot, Manoj. I don't know if I'll take all the 10 minutes. I'll take a few. And Mr. Milewski, it's great to meet you, even though it's virtually. And congratulations on this book. It was interesting to me to actually go through some of this because I was the US correspondent for NDTV in 2004, 5, 6. And in 2005, to mark the 20th anniversary of the Kanishka bombing, I had actually traveled to Toronto and spoken to some of the victims, survivors, families, and to discuss their sentiments, their thoughts 20 years later. So both a colleague of mine had gone to Cork in Ireland, and I had gone to Toronto, and we had kind of compiled our recording and our interviews. That documentary, actually, Manoj, I don't know if you remember this, but it won a special commendation at the Indian Television Awards, because I don't think any Indian TV journalist certainly had actually taken the time to revisit a really horrific terrorist attack from the 1980s. I also remember very vividly growing up as a teenager in a Delhi which was, sandbagged in the 80s, all along the streets, where families were gunned down in South Delhi by Khalistani militants, terrorists. I mean, today we use the word terrorists, and rightfully so. There is a lot of, I guess, there's a visceral emotional response as well when you read some of Mr. Milewski's narrative and the interviews. Just a couple of comments before I move on, the relevance of this book in terms of the political landscape. I think as a journalist and as a piece of journalism, it's actually quite stupendous, because I like the way that you have not elongated your narrative. I mean, the chapters are crisp, they're concise, they're short. They sort of give you a sense of immediacy and urgency with which you seem to have approached the telling of this very important story, whether it is the botch-ups from the Canadian side, whether it is the imperatives or the cynicism from the Pakistani side, or even the sort of foot dragging perhaps from the Indian side in some instances as well. So I think I like the form, and I think that's very important when you're reading a book on a subject which actually there isn't much written about. I mean, for all that we talk about the Khalistan insurgency, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of books that are out there, not just for an Indian audience, but for a global audience. And I think the fact that a Canadian journalist is choosing to tell this story from the Canadian perspective indicates to me that there is actually a global need and a global context in which the story must be told and must be received. So I think thank you for having made that effort, and for the diligent research that you've put into this. So I'd like to kind of start with that. It's an interesting time to bring out a book like this because after, I would say, even as a reporter, I mean, a decent gap in time, Khalistan and Khalistani actors and Sikh separatists seem to be back in the news. Now, whether they're back in the news for, I don't want to use the word genuine for in case it's misconstrued, but whether they're in the news for actual truthful reasons, as in they're regrouping or there's something going on that India needs to be worried about, or whether they're back in the news for what Mr. Milewski called sort of information wars, to sort of play out and wage information wars, I think is a matter of concern today. It's also a matter of investigation and certainly journalistic interest. So the combination of all these things has brought some of this back in the news. We saw it play out earlier this year on Republic Day, for example. We see it play out when the farmers are agitating on agricultural policy on the borders of Delhi and from Punjab, and the sort of mixing of political separatism with farmers' rights, with land rights. It's a crucible right now in which everything seems to be bubbling over. But the question to me is there more to it that meets the eye right now? And I think to that end, the policies of our Western neighbor that you touch upon in the support it gave to the Khalistan movement in the 70s and the 80s, as a means of, taking revenge, waging war, teaching India a lesson, whatever framework we want to use. Is there a revival of such motivation? And if so, what does that mean to an already volatile region, which is plagued by multiple security considerations that are not just domestic but regional? We're seeing what's happening vis-a-vis Afghanistan also right now. And how does it play into current political commentary within the country, which is sort of feasting on binaries that focus on identity politics, that focus on divisions within faith, culture, religion, society, etc. So is it something, and maybe Mr. Milewski can respond to this, when he comes back for comments. Is there something there to be analyzed on whether the information wars that the Khalistanis are waging today is sort of deliberately feeding um, a society and feeding a climate where generally things are being interpreted now in black and white? So, is there a gray, and if so, what would that gray be today when you look at? I think it's really important that you keep underscoring in the course of the book and in the interviews that you've given, because I did look up some of your interviews as well before this conversation, that you say that many of the victims of Khalistani actors were also Sikhs, and the Sikhs themselves in Punjab, particularly, have resoundingly sort of disassociated themselves in many ways from some of the actors you still see in the Sikh diaspora. So what is the interaction between the diaspora and Punjab today? How does that manifest? I think that's an important area of further inquiry as well. And I'd like to see maybe some more, either from Mr. Milewski or somebody who picks up on his work and takes it forward, to kind of look at some of those narratives. Like I said, when I was in Toronto in 2005 to interview some of these families, I'm sure we've met some of the same people in the course of my journalistic work as well. Hari Venkatesh and Lata Pada and people like that. I think you know them as well. It's really heartbreaking, and I think, Manoj, that's really in the scheme of the way we talk about terrorism in India, and we talk about terror attacks against Indians or against the Indian state. We talk about Kandahar, we talk about the Mumbai siege, we talk about the 93 Mumbai bombings, we talk about the Samjhauta Express, we talk about the Mumbai train blast. But the Kanishka bombing seems to have receded from public memory. And I think, therefore, the fact that this book is coming out serves a dual purpose. One is to remind many Indians who see terrorism as a linear narrative of jihadism or Islamism, that there are other actors in the region at play, other factors. The common thread may well be cross-border terrorism as an instrument of the Pakistani state waging war against India. But I think religion has less to do with it, and sort of uh, the nature of subcontinental conflict might have more to do with it. That's one. So I think it opens up those questions, and it really sort of reminds people that India has been at the receiving end of different kinds of terror formations, different kinds of terrorist activity. So that's an important contribution, I think, that this book makes, just at a level of public discourse. At another level, I think it's really important because it brings back front and center the importance of continuing to remain focused on the fact that this was also an act of terrorist violence, a spectacle of violence that resulted in widespread human tragedy across continents. We need to talk about it much more. We need to be able to sort of say that, if the courts have not delivered justice, if governments have not delivered justice, that at least in the minds of the people, this is a real tragedy. It cannot and must not be forgotten. So I don't mean at the political level at all. I don't mean politicizing it, and I don't mean sort of leveraging it for political gain at the elections either, whether in India or in Canada for that matter. But I do think that it's important that this book kind of serves as a timely reminder of the complexities of the Khalistan movement, of the motivations, of the geopolitical sort of intentions of enemy states vis-a-vis each other. But I think more importantly, it's really a human story. So, I'd like to sort of end my comments with that, Manoj. I don't know if I've taken 10 minutes or more time or less time, but I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Maya. I think you've done well to do the memories, because people forget that, when 9/11 happened, that only it was a succession of how terrorists were thinking of using civil aviation as a means of terrorism. Meaning it began with this, Kanishka told you that there were plans for bombing another aircraft also at the time. Suicide bombing, again, some of the LTT pioneers, both again, to a certain extent. So, meaning I lost a relative. Another relative actually saw terrorists aim a gun at him, and he was very lucky. He ducked, and the bullet went and hit the helmet behind him, which is just nearby in Chittaranjan Park in Delhi. So in those days in Delhi, terrorism, in the era of Khalistani terrorism, a lot of things around us. In case, let's go ahead, go on with this, and I'll now request Mr. Deol to give us his remarks. I think your paper is in Ontario, Canada. I'm not sure, but whatever it is, you're welcome to make your remarks, and we'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yes, I'm based in Brampton, which is west of Toronto. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me for this discussion on Blood for Blood, 50 Years of Global Khalistani Project by Terry Milewski. Many feel that Khalistan movement started in June '84 due to and after Operation Blue Star. The truth is it started long before that, although June and November 1984 tragedies give it a big boost. Terry Milewski has rightfully named it 50 Years of Global Khalistani Project and traced it back to '71. Connected it to General Jahia Khan's warm welcome to Jagjit Singh Chauhan, who later declared himself President of Khalistan, and also connected to then Pak Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in '73 with reference to Tariq Fateh, a very well-known writer and journalist. It is important that eminent veteran journalist Terry Milewski sees it this way. Terry has a lot of knowledge and information about how Khalistanis operate in Canada. He has covered Air India bombing case and Khalistani activity for over 3 decades. Blood for Blood was war cry of Babbar Khalsa leaders Talwinder Parmar and Ajab Singh Bagri. I would like to mention that there were incidents of violence or planned violence in Canada before June 1984. There is a Brampton-based Gurdwara which holds a Shahidi parade every year to memorize the so-called Khalistani Shaheeds more than Guru Arjan, the 5th Guru, which was also murdered by then Lahore Darbar during this time. So this Gurdwara publishes a booklet called Sikh Struggle. In 2012, they published this book, The Sikh Struggle, and in this booklet, they mentioned many Canadian Sikh Shaheeds. One of the Sikh Shaheeds moved to Canada in 1982 and went back to India before June 1984, according to this publication. He was in and out of India many times taking part in so-called Khalistani struggle and faced police bullets in 1989. There was firing outside Indian Consulate Toronto in 1982, and 3 persons were seriously wounded, including a police officer. 2 Khalistani supporters were convicted and jailed for 14 years. This predates June 1984. When Mrs. Indira Gandhi visited New York in 1981 and addressed Sikh congregation in Richmond Hill Gurdwara, a gunman from Toronto was there to shoot her in the Gurdwara, but some Sikhs stopped him outside. Ex-RAW officer GBS Sidhu has described this incident in his book, The Khalistan Conspiracy, and this incident predates June 1984. This book is important document as Terry has described how non-serious Canadian political leadership was and still is. His encounter with NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, as described in the book, Sophie Trudeau and Hitman Atwal proves it. Above all, how poorly the families of Air India victims were treated by Canadian establishment for decades. Khalistanis use double standard. On the one hand, terrorist Talwinder Singh Parmar is a shaheed for them, and on the other hand, they claim Air India bombing was an act of Indian plot. They like to forget that Inderjeet Singh Ryat admitted his role and role of Parmar in this act of mass murder. Ryat lied in the court under oath to save Rukduman Singh Malik and Ajab Singh Bagri. Many Khalistanis use this acquittal of Malik and Bagri as proof of innocence. But they like to forget that buddy of Parmar and member of Babbar Khalsa, Inderjeet Singh Ryat, was convicted 3 times in 3 cases related to this bombing. This book has listed all 3 convictions of Ryat in detail. Intimidation and threats were used as weapon to scare the witnesses. Indo-Canadian Times editor Tara Singh here was murdered because he was a witness in this case. It is sad that in Canada, the witnesses felt unsafe to tell the truth, even in the courts. Witness name Miss D and Miss E and others faced threats, and Terry has described those in detail in this book. Journalists like Terry Milewski and Kim Bolan faced intimidation and threats and many civil court cases for years. A New York-based Khalistani leader connected with Pakistan been advocating for years to use court cases to silence journalists like Terry Milewski, Kim Bolan, and others. And here I agree with Terry that they have changed their tactics. When we look at Khalistan movement outside India, Canadian Khalistanis are a lot more organized and effective. Beside Air India bombing, many more violent incidents took place in Canada or were planned in Canada. Parmar was not the only Canadian Khalistani who went to Pakistan and then to India to lead the terrorist movement. There were many others. Khalistanis openly praise those terrorists as shaheeds. Year after year, their portraits are displayed in many Gurdwaras and annual Vaisakhi parades by Gurdwaras. Gurdwaras are registered charities and should stay away from such activities. Canadians are going to vote for new government on September 20th. All main political parties have many pro-Khalistani candidates. No matter which party wins, Khalistani influence will stay, and so will reverse flow to India, which India should worry about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deol. And now we'll have our last speaker, Dr. Smruti, FN Studies and Analysis. Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. Unlike others who have gone through this book, my knowledge about this book basically comes from reading the newspaper where the book has been reviewed. But as has already been mentioned, my memories of the Khalistan movement goes back, to the time when one used to listen to the radio at that point of time, and the violence which was taking place in Punjab when I was a student of graduation, far, in the eastern part of India, to whom at that point of time Punjab appeared to be, very, very far off, that kind of thing. So therefore, my memories are much more different. And of course, being a student of political science, this is something, when you speak of the federalism and all, one studied the Punjab problem in the context of, the master's class on government and politics in India. So therefore, my point in this book, about this book is, the emphasis on 71. I think the 71 itself is a very watershed movement as far as the South Asian region is concerned, because it marked the birth of Bangladesh, and that in fact to a very large extent encouraged similar kind of movements in other part of the region, that it is not just a kind of imagination of the nation state, the manner in which you can define what is the nation state, but the birth of Bangladesh definitely provided a hope. I'm not saying that it regenerated or ignited a kind of ethnic passion among the people who have felt they are being marginalized within the construction of the identity of the nation state. But the 71 provided a hope. So therefore, it is not that in October, as Terry has mentioned, that there was an advertisement in New York Times where it proclaimed about, having an independent Sikh state. But also at the same time, if you look at the Times of India editorial at that point of time, there was also an article giving the same kind of hope regarding the Tamil movement, which, of course, it had not crystallized in that sense. It crystallized in a much more fashion in 1977. But that also provided a kind of hope. So in a sense, the nation state or the territorial boundary which came into place in 1947 is actually not something which has been, cast in stone. So there can be a change, and probably that could be also one of the reasons why 71 is a watershed as far as all this kind of ethno-national movement in the region is concerned. And also, I would like to bring, it is as Maya was also mentioning, that, this question of Khalistan, if somebody asks me about the Khalistan movement, the potential of this movement, to become bigger in the future, it immediately comes to one's mind, what Khalistan movement we're speaking, we don't see, especially for living in the India, apart from a particular incident being exploited by the Khalistanis, the international Khalistani diasporas, we really do not hear much about, the people, the movement. Of course, with the tweet generation, you keep on, this is something which has been kept alive. If you're not, it does not come in the mainstream media, you find, the mention of the movement in social media, especially. So therefore, I would say that, given the kind of importance in the political space in Canada, some of this sympathizer of the Khalistani movement has got, that creates a kind of apprehension, because it's not about the Khalistan movement only. I'm just expanding a little bit, because if you look at the Tamil movement, the same kind of thing once, the Sri Lanka keeps on accusing about the diaspora and the importance of diaspora to any kind of movement, not in terms of funding, but in drawing the international attention. And that is where I think probably India is much more worried about the activities, the political activities of the Khalistanis and the electoral advantage which they have got in Canada, because after all, the Sikh, they constitute a large constituency in the electoral space in Canada. So therefore, they are important. The views are important, and of course, it remains a kind of irritant which continues. Even if how much ever we want this movement to wish away this movement, but you keep on seeing glimpses of the activities of the Khalistanis either in the social media, as was mentioned also during the farmers movement. It was being hijacked. I would not say hijacked, probably legitimizing, or the Khalistan is trying to pose themselves as a kind of representatives of what is happening within India, within the Sikh community or in Punjab. So it is a kind of, looking at a kind of legitimacy. At least to tell the people of Punjab, the Khalistan movement is not dead. Rather, it is looking for issues within India where, you can head on. So therefore, I would say that this Terry's book is something which is very, very interesting. It brings back, because I think after the passage of 50 years, it is significant to look back how the movement shaped and how the kind of terror form it took internationally, and India's concern about this movement. I just end here. Thank you so much. Wonderful listening to all of you.
I think now we have roughly 15 minutes. So what I think we can do is that if we have questions to each other, or we have questions for Terry, we can pose them. And I'd like to give the word to Terry eventually. And so I would like to start off, Terry, with this important character called Talwinder Singh Parmar. And there were a lot of charges at that time also, because I was in Punjab. I used to cover terrorism there at that time. What the charge that Talwinder Singh Parmar was actually captured by the Indian security forces, tortured, and then he wrote out a confession, and then it was a staged encounter. Now, frankly, between you and me, I don't disbelieve it. For the simple, as a journalist, I have a rule of thumb: any kind of an encounter in which no one from the good side, amongst the good guys, die or is injured, there's a problem, And in the Parmar encounter, that was one of the issues. But I also happened to hear a conversation when I was in a police office. At that time, when the Canadians, when there was the Canadian High Commission for his remains, and I picked up certain things. So the point I'd like to make is, because if you look at the very quick decline of the Khalsa movement in India, I'm saying you had in June 92, Ajit Singh alias Lal Singh was arrested in Bombay in June, and he was someone who Parmar knew well. Then in August, the top leader of Babbar Khalsa in India was eliminated. I think it was in Jalandhar or Ludhiana. He was living. Name was Sukhdev Singh Babbar. Then in October, Talwinder Singh Parmar gets. Is caught and eventually eliminated along with Pakistani ISI officer. I think my went down. So that was my point with regard to Parmar, because I know that he is extremely significant. I have absolutely no particular sympathy for that, because he lived by the sword and he died. And so that's my issue, my question. Anyone else would like to raise a question? Please do so.
Shall I proceed to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. First, allow me to comment on the very popular, widely accepted story that Parmar was the victim of a staged encounter, that he was tortured and extrajudicially executed by the Punjab police. There are some problems with the story, but first let me say that many of these stories are entirely credible to me. There is no point in having this discussion if we do not acknowledge that there were vicious human rights abuses on both sides. That there were indeed fake encounters. Many of these were discovered by a very capable human rights worker, Mr. Kalra, and the evidence that he produced, going right down to purchases of wood for midnight cremations, the evidence was pretty good. There were hundreds of such cases. However, the other problem is that the case of Parmar does not seem to be one of those for many reasons. The first is that that typically the faked encounters that were reported and identified and seemed real were those in which unidentified corpses were quietly cremated in the dead of night without notice to family, without public announcement, without even identifying the victim. This happened a lot, and it should not have happened. But that does not describe the Parmar case, where the shootout in which he died along with 5 other gunmen, including, as you rightly point out, a Pakistani ISI agent, actually 2 Pakistani agents died alongside Parmar. First thing you don't do if you're having a fake encounter in which you want to quietly eliminate somebody off camera, as it were, and off the record, the last thing you do is call a public inquiry and have 25 witnesses come and give sworn testimony, and then make that testimony public, including the witnesses like Parmar's own mother and his sister. Now, that is what actually happened in this case. And the shootout happened in broad daylight. An entire village, Kangarayan, witnessed and heard the gunfire starting 5:30 in the morning. And why the police would have dragged out 5 additional bodies, thereby vastly complicating the cover-up if they were trying to keep it quiet, is difficult to understand. Why on earth would they do that? Because if any one of those 6 in total people had been seen in police custody beforehand, that would undermine the official story. So it made it much more likely that it could be undermined to have these additional bodies laid out. And then they asked the villagers to come and see if they could identify any of these people. And one of the policemen that was involved was able to identify Parmar. They came from the same village. These facts, and they are facts, make it seem as though the authorities would have had to impose upon themselves the requirements of an extremely large and complicated cover-up to make it into the so-called fake encounter. That was not described by the witnesses, and the reason why you might say that there were no casualties on the police side was because of that vast disparity in firepower between the gang that was surprised by the police and the police, who had advance warning that Parmar and his group, his armed group, were moving around in the region, and therefore set a net of roadblocks all around the neighborhood. So there were dozens of police involved, all heavily armed. They were ready, and Parmar was not. He was in a car with, granted, some heavy weapons, including a rocket launcher and a machine gun. But they weren't ready for the battle that the police were ready for. And when they were stopped and challenged, they jumped out of the car, fired on the police, ran into the lentil fields, and were cut down by police fire coming at them from all different angles. So it's easy to understand, once you look at all of that, why the official account held up. for all these years. And by contrast, and this is my final comment on that, is that there was an attempt at the Air India judicial inquiry in Ottawa some years back. There was an attempt to bring to the inquiry evidence by one of the policemen concerned that, in fact, Parmar had been captured and interrogated before the shootout. And after a big build-out, it turned out, and it was even said, by the way, that this officer had tapes of Parmar's confession. Well, it turned out that that was all nonsense. None of it turned out to be true. And the officer concerned never testified. Why didn't he testify? Oh, well, he was afraid, the story was put about that he was afraid for his security if he testified to all of this. Well, that's odd, because his identity had long since been made public in Indian papers months before. But he wasn't afraid of his identity being revealed and that there might be reprisals against him in India where it mattered, but he was worried about it in Canada. I don't buy it. I don't buy any of the story that he was extrajudicially executed after being tortured and confessing. This confession has never shown up. The evidence for the fake encounter has never showed up. I don't buy it.
And I must say that my own copy, rare copy of the report, I still have it. System here through it in great detail. But anyone else, Maya, Balraj, Smruti, if you'd like to ask questions, because we can ask each and then we can have to respond because we're out of time.
Can I ask one?
Yes, is it my turn? Terry, the surprise is those who say, Terry, those who claim that Talwinder was arrested and then eliminated to hide the truth about Air India, they also claim that Lakhvir Singh Rode was behind the plot of Air India. I feel, what difference does it make if they want to prove that it was not Talwinder, it was Lakhvir Rode? It still connects with the Khalistani militants.
Yes, you're quite right.
You're
quite right. This is another, I should have mentioned that too, that this is another problem with the whole confession story, that if you read the supposed confession that this Indian magazine Tehelka exposed when it came up with this whole story, it has Parmar confessing that he provided the dynamite for the bombing of Air India. So where does this get us? If it's true that he was, that he did make a confession prior to being killed, then that confession merely confirms his guilt, which we already knew was confirmed. I mean, what's the point?
Anyone, I'm going to wind up in exactly 5 minutes now. I think, Smruti, you, Dr.
Yeah.
wanted to ask.
I just wanted to ask that how does he look at the future of this movement? Does it have a future, or it will remain at a rhetorical level?
I think it's a good question, and it does have a future. At least that's my fear. I'm not a prophet. I am not in the prediction business, but I look at the facts. Consider, for example, that last October, less than a year ago, in an official, not a semi-official, but an official Chinese newspaper, the English language Global Times, which is run by the official publication of the Chinese Communist Party, People's Daily. Global Times ran a learned article by a pro-Communist Party academic, supposedly, saying that, look, India had better realize that if India is going to support an independent Taiwan, which China, of course, considers its territory. If India is going to support Taiwan, well, China might very well start supporting independence movements in India. So we need not wait for the first shot to be fired in that front. It's already been fired. And we should heed that warning, particularly since now China is making common cause with its client state in Pakistan and basically owns Pakistan. And now you have a northern front facing Indian strategists, which combine the threat from China and Pakistan. As I said earlier, I don't think that the Khalistan movement has much to do with the popular support. It's not some grassroots movement with people out in the streets clamoring for an independent state. That's not happening. In the last Punjab elections, as I mentioned in the book, the separatist party of Simranjit Singh Mann got 0.3% of the vote, a microscopic number. None of the above, nota, none of the above got more than twice as many votes as the separatists got in the last Punjab election, and that's been pretty much the record for the past 30 years. They've failed at the ballot box. So my point about the future of the Khalistan movement is that don't count it out just because there's no support for it in India. Watch out, because it's always been about geostrategic aspirations on the part of Pakistan, and Pakistan now has a very powerful big brother that just might, I'm not predicting, but it just might have an interest, not in overtly forming an alliance with Khalistanis. No, I don't see the Chinese marching in lockstep with the Khalistanis down from the Himalayas into India, no. But I see them looking the other way, quietly tolerating and perhaps even subsidizing people who make trouble for India. I think that's entirely possible in the years ahead.
Let's have the final question. Maya, would you like to make any comment or question?
I mean, I think I kind of posed some questions for Mr. Milewski in my comments as well, which is that Smriti also asked the same question. Where does he see the movement? I mean, does he see its relevance? But I think maybe what you could clarify or what you could respond to for the sake of those who might tune into this discussion when it goes on air is the role of the Sikh diaspora in Canadian politics today. I think that's a question that many of us are intrigued by, because for a movement that seems to have sort of lost its legs, certainly in the region, the diaspora is able to keep it alive. That's one part of the story. But the Canadian government, successive governments, have a mixed relationship with this diaspora. We've seen evidence of that in earlier botched investigations, or in Mr. Trudeau bringing in unsavory supporters of Khalistan along with his delegation, etc. So you've seen both sides of the spectrum, really. Maybe you could just, shed some light on that.
I'll try to give you a short answer, and I could give you one answer in 2 words: vote bank politics. The problem that we're having in Canada, and have had for many years, is that it's extremely easy for Canadian politicians in an environment where people don't know about what most people couldn't find Khalistan on a map. I mean, it's not something that Canadians live and breathe. So they don't know any better. And when politicians at election time think that they can count on a block of very useful votes organized by Khalistani groups, it's hard to refuse. It's hard to then go to the Vaisakhi parade and see garlanded, decorated martyr pictures of Talwinder Parmar and the assassins of Indira Gandhi and the assassins of General Vaidya going down the streets in the Vaisakhi parade and look the other way and smile and wave and ignore all of this. That this is the glorification of terrorist activities. And so the politicians are allowed to get away with pandering to these groups without suffering a penalty at the ballot box, although it's not a guarantee of election. I mean, we mentioned Ujjwal Dassar, probably the most successful Sikh politician of his generation in Canada. He was the premier of the province of British Columbia, like the chief minister. He was the member of the federal cabinet, minister of health in the Paul Martin government. He was an extremely successful politician. He was elected and re-elected for 20 years in a heavily Sikh riding. So don't tell me that you can't get elected by opposing, as he did, the Khalistani hardliners. But the easy decision for many lazy politicians is to say, look, I'm not going to get into the details. All I know is that these guys are going to vote for me. I'm not going to rain on their parade. I think that's a simple explanation, but it's accurate.
Well, thank you for that candor.
Thank you, Terry. I think we've had a very useful discussion here. We've gone back to an era which I had almost, as a journalist, my life looked like the terrible period. And I think pointed out that we've almost, I think Maya pointed out, we've all this terrible 329. Me, that number is in my mind all the time, meaning I can anytime being blown out of the air. And that was so shoddy, it's not funny. And Terry, I must tell you that one of the reasons was because Talwinder Parmar was a Canadian, and they were very, very. The government wanted to show that everything was all and proper. So in case we won't go in that anymore. So I'll just thank you, thank all of you, thank all my analysts, and thank Terry in particular, who's given us a wonderful, kind of series of points here today, as well as certain insights, I think, into the Khalistan movement's potential. I think that's very invaluable for people to look at these issues, especially at the Observer Research Foundation. We have people who size in some of these areas, but I suspect many of them don't really cast their mind that far back. So in any case, once again, thank you very much, and good evening, good afternoon, or whatever it is, wherever you are. Thank you again.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.